I'm Scott Loveridge, Director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. It's my pleasure to introduce Claire Lehman and Sam Moore, who are going to talk about proposed changes to child agricultural labor regulations. And Claire is a public policy education specialist at MSU Extension who focuses on agricultural and natural resources policy. She also teaches civic participation processes to citizens and extension educators, and she's had some experience prior to her MSU experience as a legislative analyst for the Michigan Senate. Dan Moore is an MSU Extension dairy educator in the Northwest Lower Peninsula of Michigan. He has area dairy coverage for 14 counties and also statewide role as dairy labor management educator. And he's been with MSU Extension for about 20 years. So I'll turn it over to the two of you to make your presentation. Thanks a lot for joining us today. And those of you who are on the line, I'll be monitoring the chat, and so we will interrupt the speakers from time to time to direct your attention to questions you have via chat. And also this webinar will be archived on our website, where you'll be able to pull it up later and share it with stakeholders. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you,
Great.
Scott. This is Claire Lehman, and you can see I just enlarged the chat pod because we wanted to start our presentation this morning by asking you a question, which is, where have you received your information, if any, about these regulations? Where have you been hearing about these? And so you could just type your answer into the box there in the chat pod. Good to just see everyone is
Good. We're starting to see some come in from Farm Bureau and Extension.
national listservs. Adam, what kind of national listservs? From what organizations? Can you clarify or expand? Okay. Yeah, so this really has garnered a lot of national attention. And Farm Bureau has been putting out a lot of information about it. I heard, or I read actually a transcript of an NPR broadcast about it. Some of the local papers around here have put out some articles. Department of Labor, Greenhouse Trade. Yeah, so these actually are pretty broad-reaching in terms of how agriculture is defined, and I think that there's a lot of fear that these regulations will really hurt the industry. So neither Stan or I really have an opinion about them. We just wanted to present what the regulations are proposing and try to clarify some of the questions that are out there, and then give you a chance to comment to the Department of Labor. That's one of the things about regulations as opposed to statute. You don't have to go through your congressperson to give an opinion about what you think about this proposal. You can go straight to the federal website and type in your opinion. And at the very end, we'll give you the web address to do that. Okay, so as I was saying, these are regulations, not statute. The law, the statutes that govern child labor are found under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which I've abbreviated to FLSA. And that act prohibits the employment of youth under 18 in all hazardous occupations. But then it makes exceptions for youth in agriculture hazardous occupations. Then that act gives the Department of Labor the power to promulgate or write rules that would make allowances for 14 and 15-year-olds in agriculture in hazardous occupations. So I have that in red because that's really what we're going to focus on today, is the regulations that would affect 14 and 15-year-old young hired farm workers. Okay. So the Department of Labor's document is 211 pages. Stan and I have been reading it. They give a lot of reasons why these regulations are being revised. They haven't been revised since the 1970s. There's been a lot of changes in technology and in agriculture in general. They've stepped up their investigations of child labor and hired farm workers, and they've started documenting the injuries and fatalities better. So they say that their intent is to bring the safety standards for youth who work in agriculture up to the same standards as those who work in non-agricultural hazardous occupations. So here's some statistics that the Department of Labor cites in their proposal. During the 1990s, about 4% of all working youth were employed in agriculture, and that includes forestry and fishing. So it's a small percentage. But they experienced over 40% of the youth occupational fatalities. So it's a small number that this is regulating and that this would affect, but that small number would stand to be greatly affected, hopefully for the best. Okay, and here's another statistic from the Department of Labor. The fatalities among young people working in agriculture are most likely to occur among the very youngest workers. About 3/4 of occupational fatalities in self-employed jobs were in agriculture, and more than half the deaths in agriculture occurred in family business. So there's this kind of notion, at least for people maybe who don't work on a family farm, that it's this peaceful place, and it is, but small, by their very nature, small businesses require workers to not specialize in one thing, and so they have to work in a number of different conditions with many different kinds of machines, and they're often unfamiliar or can be unfamiliar with the equipment that they're using. That's why the smaller the farm, sometimes the more dangerous that it is.
All right.
Where's Stan?
Yeah, thank you, Claire. So we know the why of why they're looking at addressing these, and again, it's been about 40 years since they've last been revised. And the who is really who the rules apply to are young hired farm workers ages 14 and 15. In other words, those that are under 16 and 17-year-olds. In other non-ag industries, that 16 and 17-year-old would be the ones that we would be talking about with these special laws that apply to them, or special rules that apply to them for what would be hazardous occupations. But in agriculture, we stepped that down a couple of years. So it is kind of a special ag exemption that we have to go down to the 14 and 15-year-old young hired farm worker. It's estimated that it'll affect about 56,000 youth, and that's through a couple of different national surveys that are conducted on a semi-regular basis to estimate that it'll affect 56,000 youth. So given that currently there is already some regulation, turn on my pointer here, there is already some regulation for this age group of 14 to 15-year-olds. We wanted to ask the group with a quick poll here is how familiar you are, so I'm going to switch to that. As participants, how familiar are you with labor law, existing labor law for those 14 and 15-year-olds? Get most of you to click there, then I'll go ahead and broadcast the results.
Looks like everyone has voted. Got about 11 votes.
Yep, so should be able to see that now, kind of where you're at. So folks are, pretty good range there of experience with where current labor law is at. So we'll switch back now to the presentation. Okay, so let me turn that back off. So there's a couple of, I mentioned one exemption already, the ag exemption, and there's another exemption called the parental exemption. And all of these proposed regulations would not apply to the parental exemption under the Fair Labor Standards Act. That parental exemption is actually in the Act and supersedes the rules that would apply to those not under that exemption. So the Department of Labor all along has said that the intent with this parental exemption is to only exempt the youth that are directly supervised by a parent or a person standing in the parent's stead could also receive that parental exemption. We're going to come back to that and talk a little bit more about that definition. But so the intent was to really clarify with these rules, not to change that parental exemption, but to clarify who that applies to. There's also the concept of hired, that this individual needs to be in a hired or an employment relationship. Current regulations say the employee means to suffer or permit to work. So